Hello, and welcome to this Pedals and Patches video with me, DivKid, on the Electro Harmonix Small Stone, an absolute classic phaser pedal. We'll be using it with a whole wide range of gear. Here's what's to come. At the start, I mentioned this was a Pedals and Patches series video. This is a series where we take a look at pedal effects through the lens of creative studio setups, synths and modular gear, looking at how pedals integrate with a range of sources, interesting sound design with them, and how pedals often offer an affordable sound for more than just guitars. And this video is all about the Electro Harmonix Small Stone phaser pedal, but it's just as much a video about how to use phasers, and you could easily recreate these examples with other pedals, modular gear, plugins, or other bits of desktop processing. So this is my Small Stone. I've had it for a long time, probably over 20 years at this point. It's been gigged to death on pedal boards, thrown in and out of gig bags, things spilt on it, and you can see it's been knocked about quite a bit. It's a real classic, not just for guitars, but synths too, with its history with, say, Jean-Michel Jarre as just one example. And the Small Stone was originally released in 1975, and there's been lots of versions of it in the 50 years since then. It's still available, new from Electro Harmonix, and it's well under £100, $100 or €100. There's not much to it: mono in and out, a foot switch for on and off, an LFO rate control for the modulation of phase shifting, a colour switch that's more subtle when it's down, and then a richer, deeper resonant sound when it's switched up. The examples for the video are on screen now. Those are linked down below in the description for you to skip around. So without further ado, let's dive in. So here's a really basic patch, but one that I really love, which is using a phaser kind of in place of PWM, and you can then do that on other waveforms rather than a pulse with pulse width modulation. So I have a saw wave here, going into my pedal interface, into the phaser, and then that's coming back, and that's what we're recording. Advantage being here that rather than this being end of chain, we can process an oscillator directly while it's just droning, and then do other creative interesting things with it back in the modular, rather than the pedal being after the modular, almost like a pedal board kind of situation. So kicking in the phaser, I'll never tire of a saw wave into a rich phaser, and the Small Stone's a particularly good one for it. You can be much more subtle than this with the colour down. With that colour up, that lusher, kind of juicier phasing, slow rates. It's a sound I really like. And I say do this to saw waves instead of PWM. You could do it on top of PWM. Still sounds great on a square wave. If we then pulse width modulate the pulse or square, getting kind of double modulation right at our sound source with the oscillator, works really nicely. Let's just get a pitch sequence going, and then we'll move on to this coming back and being articulated in a modular system where we go oscillator, phaser, low pass gate, and some other effects. So here's that saw wave through a low pass gate. Playing the pitch sequence that we had going before, let's go from saw wave to Small Stone phaser to low pass gate. Then into some effects. That's Isu's trifecta there, big verb and some nice delay. And if if I start to carve out this sequence so it's less frequent, it's playing less notes. And with a really slow rate, that higher, more kind of juicy, resonant colour. Phaser before the low pass gain effects just lets those changes, those resonant notches that the phasing's doing, just kind of bloom and blossom through that ambient effects chain. Here's a dry bass tone, recorded DI and then with Logic's bass amp plugin. I love deep phasing on a bass. It's sort of used here in place of maybe an auto wah. It really picks up on those muted percussive plucks between the notes really nicely. And it's great on chords too, for some slushy, low sustained sounds. So here's a really interesting one, which is using a phaser to phase shift a waveform and modulate it before you fold it. In this instance, it's letting me actually fold square waves, which are kind of the unfoldable waveform, and just create this big brutal bass sound. It's ducking against some drums. Let's remove that for now. This is a triangle wave through the small stone phaser, then through a wave folder and a VCA that's currently fully open, it's just droning. Now I had an envelope modulating my folding. It's a nice big kind of glitchy folding sound. If I actually phase this triangle wave first, as the LFO on the phaser is actually going through that fundamental frequency of the oscillator here, it's ducking it down, giving us that this nice glitch in the waveform. But with a square, if I remove the envelope, we can't fold a square wave. There's no moving sloping edges to fold. So my envelope modulating the folder is just kind of cutting the sound in and out. But if I first mess with that square, with the phaser, giving us that blue trace there, there's lots of edges and kinks to fold. Without the envelope to the folder, this is square wave, phaser, coming through the interface again, back to folder. Add in an envelope to modulate fold, turn down our VCA, open an envelope to it, and we've a really brutal sound. Let's get a pitch sequence back in the oscillator, and if I then duck that in another VCA and add a kick drum in, oh yes. An advantage being if you had a modular phaser rather than the small stone would be you could turn off the modulation and just use that frequency of the phaser to just kind of mess with your waveform and it not modulate the signal. But generally, movement in your sound is a good thing, so having an LFO built into your phaser, I think's a nice thing here. Like a lot of instruments here in the studio, I really love this 1960s Vox Jaguar organ. And then even in mono, adding the small stone to it, it's got this really rich, evocative, almost kind of widescreen sort of feel. that then, of course, plays really nicely in some delay and reverb, big ambient stereo effects. So one fun thing with phasers, much like filters, is pinging them to create some interesting percussion sounds. And I'm accentuating that with a little bit of feedback here. Now everything except the small stone phaser pings. Sampled kick and some analog drums here, and then just the phaser. And I have a trigger coming from DivKid here. It's been probability skipped. That's coming into a mixer. The mixer is what's feeding the phaser. And then as that comes back, I have a split cable here, this black stackable cable. One copy is sent to the mix that we're listening to, and the other sent back into this mixer that feeds the input as a feedback loop, so that without the triggers, I can play around with some feedback. Which is very squeaky. Took my head off then in the headphones. When you have your triggers going in, just a little bit of it works like a kind of resonance control on a filter. And quite fast rates. Almost sound like sample and hold, because the triggers are hitting at different points in that LFO, shifting around that phasing frequency. And a nice trick here to get kind of more colour is to actually filter your triggers before they go in. So if I just open up this low pass filter, this is the trigger through the mixer hitting the pedal. Quite bright and clicky. But if I actually low pass filter the trigger, this is the DivKid trigger into a low pass, then into the mixer that's feeding the phaser. You can take off that harsh click. Pinged filters. If in doubt, ping it, which is to fire a trigger down into an audio input and see what happens. So the small stone is just kind of part of synth history. It's embedded in kind of classic synth sounds that we think of, certainly through, say, Jean-Michel Jarre. Here we have the SY1, the first synthesizer that Yamaha made. But adding phase shifting just sounds so good. It's such a vocal sounding synth. And the phasing really adds to that. And on higher lines, works really well too. And again, with vibrato. Just a little bit of vibrato warble there on the synth. And the phasing. And then into the spring reverb here from Echo Fix. Fully wet in the spring. Bringing some direct sound back in. Vibrato on, phasing spring. No tips per se, other than use a phaser on your synths. So in this patch, I actually have kind of 4 tips to go through. The first is giving Rings a really nice kind of mono ambient center, because its outputs can be too wide in a lot of situations, as they are here. Using some mixing and VCAs or low pass gates to create a creative effect send. Creating interesting, alive kind of resonances and character with phasers before your fully wet reverbs. And also taking off some harsh artifacts and transients from your reverbs too. So first, if I just mute these effects, this is Rings, straight into the mixer. And it's pinging its voices between left and right. And if you've got headphones on, you'll appreciate this sounds so super wide. There's no kind of mono center. It's really kind of odd image. Works better out of speakers than it does headphones, or you could maybe pan these in a bit in your mixer. But what I want to create with this patch is a mono kind of ambience with the reverb and the phaser here to kind of pull in that image while the dry plucks here remain really fully wide. And I think mono phaser and deliberately mono reverb, it could be stereo, but effects don't always have to be stereo. And actually a mono image here, I think creates something that's more interesting. But first, let's go through creating a creative effects end to these effects. So I'll mute everything. Let's bypass the reverb, take off the phaser, and just listen to what's happening here. If I turn down and unplug two, these split cables are splits of the stereo output. This one, the dry ring sound. They're being split into the optomix, and I'm just mixing them together in mono. So if I turn both channels up, this is like taking a single output from Rings where every note is now mono. And I've mixed these together because I don't want every other note to go to the effects, though having that option is quite interesting and you can be creative with that. I want to send everything to the effects. And then I want it to be a bit more interesting. This is the kind of creative effects send element here, which is to use envelopes to break into that stream of sound. So these envelopes are effectively my send voltages. When my envelopes play, they open these low pass gates, and that's going to send to my effects chain. And even just as a kind of interesting mono center, that can work really well without even having any of the ambient effects at play. But one other thing this allows us to do, muting Rings again, is to take off some of that direct harsh sound that in a reverb, you can hear it's got some spiky, kind of nasty transients and artifacts. It's because these are so kind of intensely plucky. So by adding some attack time to these envelopes, we're really softening the sound on the way into the reverb. And even without the phaser here, it's a much nicer sound. Let's bring the attack down quicker again. We've got that bright, artifacty, sound that just doesn't always work. So by taking some of that off, we're sending an interesting rhythm. There's also fading the sound in, just shaving off that harsher transient and attack. And if I first go through a phaser, our lovely Small Stone here, again, this without the reverb, is a nice central image to kind of pull and gel that really wide stereo ring sound together. Muting Rings again, but phaser, then reverb. The modulation of that phasing is creating resonances as those peaks move around in the sound. And that just adds this aliveness and this lushness before the reverb. It's not a really obvious phasing sound, unless you take the rate too high, when it gets a bit silly. So you're almost kind of hiding your phasing in your ambience. I think it's a really lovely result. So just running down all the kind of tips there, this is creating a nice mono center to help glue together that really wide ring sound. We're using low pass gates, but these could be VCAs or mixers here to mix and modulate a sound before it goes to our effects to create a creative effects send. We're taking off some of the attack and transients from the sound so that reverb behaves a bit nicer. And we're adding nice resonant phasing to a sound before hitting the reverb to create a more lush and alive sound. If you've got this far in the video, drop a small sync in the comments. Do you have a small stone, want a small stone, like and use phasers in general? Let us know. We're aiming to do one pedals and patches video a month through 2026, so do let us know what other pedals we should check out and what you'd like to see featured too. Head to patreon.com/DivKid to support what we do and join our amazing community. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll see you next time. Bye!